Welcome to the 2023-2024 season of Symphony 847, a professional orchestra based on Chicago's North Shore. Founded in 2020, Symphony 847 seeks to reimagine the symphony experience. As part of that reimagining, we are presenting this series of announcements, pre-concert talks, and program notes in podcast form. In the next 3 installments, you will hear from this season's soloists, featured composers, orchestra members, and me, Chris Ramaekers, Music Director of Symphony 847. So I'm here with Leanne Kelso. Leanne is the Associate Concertmaster of the Madison Symphony and the Assistant Concertmaster of the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra, and teaches violin at UW-Whitewater, and is a close friend and esteemed colleague of mine. So thank you, Leanne, for being here. The Bruch Scottish Fantasy, it's such a wonderfully tuneful lyrical piece, and it's so involved for the soloist. But he didn't call it a concerto. And he wrote 3 concertos, so he's one of which we've done together. And so he could have written a concerto and called it a concerto. He knew that was an option, but he didn't. Is this piece anything like his concertos, or is it something completely different? Or what is the deal with this Scottish Fantasy as opposed to Concerto Number 4?
Right. Well, it's a great question. I think he really is calling it a Scottish Fantasy because he was enamored of the mystical, gloomy, foggy Scottish mystique that I think you're doing the Mendelssohn. It was attractive to a lot of romantic composers. But I think in this case, Bruch actually had visited Scotland and was using the tunes. So, these are actual Scottish folk tunes that he's making a fantasy out of. And I think that's it's maybe more about evoking the Scottish spirit than that interplay between a soloist and an orchestra that defines a concerto.
Mm-hmm. It seems that those misty Scottish Highlands, Mendelssohn specifically, really captivated him.
Yeah.
Right? Not just in the symphony, but the opening of the Hebrides. All of it is just so.
Yes, it's so atmospheric, and it's a wonderful material. I think another thing that I was thinking about with this piece is that he dedicated it to Sarasate, and of all those virtuosi who were playing at the time, Sarasate was known best for the beauty of tone. He was somebody who took the sweetness of his tone as seriously as the fireworks with the left hand. So I think he was a very emotional player, and I feel like that idea of it being a fantasy and it being played by Sarasate, he was described sometimes as playing so effortlessly that it might have been casual, and that's the player he envisioned doing this fantasy on the songs. So.
Yeah, in studying this piece, I've been thinking about that quite a bit, because what does it say that you got a Scottish fantasy by a German composer written for a Spanish violinist? What? Do you think you can hear? Was he envisioning Sarasate when he wrote the piece?
I think so, for sure. Yeah. Especially, I think maybe the third movement, the most song-like, just makes me think of the tenderness that Sarasate was known for. It's weird because as a violinist, you encounter Sarasate's works. Usually, the first time you encounter one, it's just the hardest thing you've ever played. And it seems like he must have valued virtuosity above all else. But the people who lived in his time talked about the beauty of his tone, the sweetness of his tone, actually the sort of measuredness of his virtuosity.
Since you've touched on it already, this piece is based on not just folk music in a general sense, but specific folk tunes, right? We know what they are, and we have recordings of them. How does that influence and maybe impact how you think about or prepare this piece? I mean, something like the Bruch Concerto is lyrical and beautiful,
right,
but it's not a pre-existing song. Does it change if you know it's a song that is already out there in the world?
I think it does. I mean, it's nice to have some words to put together with it. I mean, the last movement is warlike. It just is, you know, so no matter how elegantly you're going to try to make that, because it's a fantasy on that, there you have a certain permission to really play it like you mean it, because it's basically a warlike, you know, encouragement to go to battle. So it's kind of fun to consider the words, and same thing with the third movement is kind of a lament. And yeah, I think preparing anything takes a lot of technique and in-depth problem solving, but then having the words in the songs, once you get to the more privileged part where you're interpreting or deciding how you're going to play it, is a wonderful aspect.
We talked about how this piece isn't called a concerto, but it kind of is. I mean, you know, you're standing up in front of the orchestra and the whole thing. How does this piece vary from playing something like the Tchaikovsky or the Sibelius or a Mozart concerto? Or is it, do you approach it any differently because it's not, air quotes, a concerto?
Well, I hadn't thought a lot about that. I think it is very concerto-like in its demands, and as much as it's a Scottish fantasy, it really lies right in Bruch's normal use of the violin. If I think of it more instrumentally, it's very typically Bruch.
Yeah.
And so in that way, the approach is really similar. But certainly it is a different format. It's more seamless in my mind than the typical 3-movement concerto form. And the way that I enter is different from a lot of concertos. I mean, if we're talking about the last movement, just I state the theme first. I mean, that's a great deal of fun, just to change the character and not be introduced by an orchestra. So I think there are similarities and differences.
When we first talked about doing this piece earlier this year, you seemed to have a pretty enthusiastic reaction to this piece specifically. Yes. What is it about this piece that speaks to you? Where, before you even started preparing it, where did that enthusiasm come from?
Well, I'm working on another piece called Air by Aaron J. Kernis right now. And
I love this music.
Yeah, it's a beautiful piece, but I had never heard it or played it. And what drew me to it was the subtitle or something I saw in program notes calling it a love song to the violin. And I thought, oh, I should check that piece out. I love the violin. But in some ways, the connection is I feel that Bruch loved the violin. He really understood the voice of the violin. He uses the right keys for the kind of color he wants. And when he uses chromatic harmonies, it's always so flattering, and you can just dig deep into what a violin can do without forcing, without struggling. It just is it's natural and sort of sincere music, I think.
Well, you make it sound like this piece is pretty easy to play.
That's not true.
That's not been my experience. This piece just happens.
It is not an easy piece. It's like custom fit. It's like a made-to-order suit for the violin. So you have to work at it, but it fits beautifully.
Just like being able to wear a made-to-order suit, you have to work. While we're on the topic, what are some of the challenges in this piece? I mean,
Yeah, he. So one of the things Bruch loves to do is to combine double or triple step playing with passage work. So that is hard to do because you're sort of running up and down the fingerboard and then needing to manipulate across the strings, all while playing in tune and preserving musical direction. So it's hard, but it does lie well on the instrument, so that helps with it a lot. I mean, one of the other challenges is to make a sound that is big enough to compare and contrast with the orchestra without ever sounding forced. So and I do think that Bruch is good with orchestration and writing with the right color. I mean, a soloist has to work to make it happen, but hopefully sometimes it's not a matter of purely being loud enough to compete with the orchestra, but by making a distinctive enough tone, a dark enough tone, or an eerie enough tone, or a sweet enough tone that the ear is drawn to it. And balance is always a challenge in a concerto, sure. But I think Bruch helps me to not think of it as a loudness problem as much as an attention problem, a color, a drawing the listener's ear problem.
Mm-hmm. So. I like that. That's something as a conductor I think about a lot, where it's not really a matter, I mean, we talk about orchestral balances, of course, a lot, but it's really not a matter of you play louder. It's everybody else notice them.
Yes.
It's just, you couldn't really even quantify that they are a little bit louder than everybody else. It's just that everyone's attention somehow goes over here instead of over here.
There's a wonderful quartet, the Cavani Quartet, and they published some ideas for how to coach chamber music. And one of the ideas that they promote is that the accompanying voices act as a spotlight on the solo voice. So it's not that you're trying to play softer than them, it's that you're trying to direct attention to them. Just like you were saying, it's not all about loud and soft. It has a lot to do with intention.
I like that a lot. Yeah. One of the things I talk about with my conducting students is not it's not about watch me or keep the tempo. It's finding out where in the music the tempo is and having people pay attention to that. And then if you watch me or not, I don't really care. Like, that's not the point, you know what I mean? Because you can kind of tell if the group is like just watching the conductor and then just playing, right? As opposed to, they're still, again, you can't quantify the difference, right? But they're still playing in time, but they're just paying attention to where that pulse is in the music.
Yes.
Instead of some abstract click, click, click.
Yeah.
Somewhere.
The groove is there.
The groove is there, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Since we talked about playing with the orchestra, you have a long career as an orchestral violinist. Everyone should know that Leanne and I work together frequently, and actually I think we've worked together much more often in a soloist capacity. You've played in groups I've conducted before, but
right.
Mostly you're the soloist. We've done it 3 or 4 times at least.
Yeah.
But you have a long career as an orchestral violinist. How is it different to play this piece, or really any piece? How is playing in the orchestra different than standing up in front of it? Especially, you're still playing the violin,
right?
So how is that different?
Oh, it's a world of difference. When you're in a section, I think the highest value is to mind meld with the people around you, and to play like one big glorious violin. And then when you're the soloist, it's very different because you're trying to set the tone and lead and suggest by example what kind of sound or what kind of articulation we're going to do. So you're still part of that wonderful large ensemble, but with much more of a leadership and suggesting and inspiring kind of role than when you're in the section trying to match. there are challenges to both, because when you're trying to match, it's almost as if another task has been added to your plate. You must play in time, you must play with beautiful tone, you must play in tune, you must play exactly like the person next to you. When you're the soloist, you need to do all those things, but the added task is to do it as beautifully, as big, as expressively as possible. But those are kind of baked into our sense of ourselves as a musician. So there are challenges in both. They're both really, really satisfying. I will say, when you're playing an orchestra, sometimes when I've gotten to play with people I really admire, one of the challenges is to pay attention and not just start listening to the soloist.
You know, so that is a like kind of an oddly like famous, I don't know if that's a word for it, but problem is that with a great soloist, you have to, as the conductor, really be careful coming out of the cadenzas.
Right.
Because the orchestra has their jaws on the floor. How can this person play that? And then, oh, shoot, I have to play my part. Well, I think I can ask this question, and maybe we'll cut this depending how it goes, but I think I can ask this question to you because we work together so frequently. There is a famous concert with Leonard Bernstein and Glenn Gould. They're doing the Brahms First Piano Concerto, and they had a disagreement about how it all goes. And Bernstein comes out and makes a little introduction, and he says, "I don't agree with anything that you're going to hear." Have you heard this?
I haven't heard this story.
I'm going to send you a link to this. In this very charming Leonard Bernstein way,
yes,
says, that of course raises the question, what am I doing conducting this? You know? And then he of course says that Mr. Gould is such a valid of an artist that I think you should hear this. But still, when conducting a concerto, who's the boss? And I think to an audience who goes to a concert, you know, even regularly, it might seem like I'm the guy standing up there on a box waving a stick, right? Who is the boss? How does that work? I mean, what is, from your perspective, right? And perspective, what do you think the conductor-soloist relationship is in a situation like this? How do you and I reach that balance? Because there can't be two leaders. Right,
no. I mean, most of the time that I've played a solo, which is not my always job. I mean, I'm often playing in the orchestra. So, but I feel like you meet to set general expectations and where we sort of want the tempo to be and that kind of thing. But I feel as if when I'm playing a concerto, I'm not trying to lead the overall tempo or exactly how a retard goes. Like, hopefully we've had a conversation where we lay out the general plan for that. But it's like the conductor is the person who makes it that I'm collaborating with one giant voice, as opposed to what I think would be a really challenging position of collaborating with everyone on stage. So I feel as if it's like not two leaders exactly, but like partners with the orchestra, mostly going with the conductor, except maybe tone and articulation coming from the soloist. And I guess the one exception would be there are places where, especially when there's a particular woodwind or brass solo, where it almost is like then at that moment, the partnership is more between that soloist and the main soloist, because I think 3 ways even is too much. Mm-hmm. Like 2 works, but 3 is hard to manage. But I think in general, that's in my mind, that's how it's working. I mean, in the actual moment of playing music, I think there are so many things that happen that you'd be hard pressed to explain before or after.
Amen to that. Yeah, I almost think of it as like when it really, like, a concerto is almost always chamber music on some level, right? Yeah. But it's not so much maybe you and I will disagree with it on this in November, but that it's really more of it's like a duet plus, right?
Yes.
So the two voices in the chamber ensemble are you and I,
right?
And I'm dealing with the orchestra, and then of course every now and again a voice in the orchestra you'll kind of grab onto that,
right?
You deal with that, and
yeah. It's sort of there's no way around sometimes. Well, that spotlight idea, and I think that the composer's doing it when he chooses to do that, is to shift the spotlight over to this new pairing where it's like, oh, let's hear how violin and flute sound together, and create that new timbre.
It's funny for me as a conductor to, when you become aware of those shifting spotlights, how just simply being aware of like, oh, the composer is just, your attention goes here now. Things that feel like incredibly complicated ensemble technical challenges just evaporate.
Yes.
Because it's just, oh, listen over there, go over there. And it just fixes it.
It's all about attention. It's so interesting. I think that's why transitions are often so hard, because oftentimes the focus is shifting, and you have to figure out how and at exactly what moment and how that new voice is going to emerge, or is it going to interrupt, or what's the nature of that handoff.
This piece is repertoire, but you have been a violinist for the majority of your life, and I'm not a violinist. I have conducted this piece a couple of times, but I was well into adulthood before I learned this piece. And I assume this is a piece the violinists know from a relatively young age. Do you remember your first encounter with this piece? Was it a recording? Was it playing it? Was it an orchestra? Do you have any memory of when you first became aware of this wonderful piece?
Well, I studied it when I was an undergrad. I didn't do the whole thing. But I'm trying to think my first awareness of it. I used to go to symphony concerts all the time as a child, and so I know I heard it with the Florida West Coast Symphony in Sarasota. I honestly don't remember who the soloist was, but my family is Scottish, and so we were all super excited. There was this Scottish fantasy. It was like it had been written for me. No, not really. But
for all of the Kelso clan.
I had waited and waited to play it. So when I got to play it as an undergrad, I was super excited and also kind of scared because it seemed really hard. But yeah, it's a standard piece. Although I will say of Mr. Bruch that it's really just his concerto in G minor that keeps his always place in the repertoire. Like every high school violinist plays that concerto, and some people play the Scottish Fantasy, and it's programmed a lot, but nothing comes close in Bruch's output to that second violin concerto.
Bruch would be so sad to hear you say that.
I know.
He even lamented it at the time.
Yes, absolutely. It's just, but it has really stuck in the repertoire that way. And I came across a few years ago, he made these Swedish dances that are very beautiful. And that, for me, I had not heard them till I was well into adulthood. I mean, I think it was about 10 years ago that someone played them on a concert, and they're just charming and lovely, and like so many other things that he wrote has not been played as much.
What do you hope that the audience takes away from this performance?
What I get from this piece is, I think, what those romantic composers wanted, which is it's so full of different varied emotions. A tune that starts out sad and suddenly takes a turn into a much more dramatic mode. And there are moments in this piece that I associate with my father. And then there are, the fourth movement is just all the warlike, cacophony and virtuosity. And it's just, I hope that everybody gets to be alone with the piece and just let it evoke what it evokes for them. It's so full of highs and lows, reflection and energy. it's really so full of emotion. And I hope that people just enjoy that sense that all those highs and lows are shared between all of us. Mm-hmm. That, you know, we all live in that same world of ups and downs. And part of classical music is that it doesn't put words or definitions on those feelings. You can just listen, and it, whatever it means to you is just right.